camping had always been my escape. After my divorce 2 years ago, I found solace in nature. Just me, my gear, and the quiet hum of the wilderness. I'd spent most weekends exploring remote trails, and the isolation became comforting, even therapeutic. My co-workers would joke about how I was one bear attack away from a Netflix documentary. But I shrugged it off. They didn't get it. Out here, I felt alive. This time I chose a secluded spot deep in Oregon's Cascade Mountains. It was late fall, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones as soon as the sun goes down. I liked it that way. Fewer people ventured out in the colder months, which meant fewer chances of running into strangers. The drive to the trailhead had taken nearly 4 hours, and by the time I pitched my tent near a quiet riverbank, the sun was already setting. The sky was a bruised purple, streaked with fading orange, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine. I cooked a quick dinner over a portable stove, sipping cheap instant coffee while staring into the fire. By the time I zipped myself into the tent, exhaustion had me drifting off within minutes. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the first thing I noticed was how eerily quiet it had gotten. The usual nighttime symphony, the chirp of crickets, the occasional rustle of branches, was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt unnatural. Then came the sound, faint, deliberate, just outside my tent. It wasn't the wind or the shuffle of leaves, it was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dirt. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing, as I strained to listen. The steps were slow, measured, almost careful, as if whoever, or whatever it was, didn't want to be heard. My mind raced. A bear? No, bears don't move like that. A person? But why would anyone be out here, miles from the nearest trailhead, in the dead of night? I reached for my flashlight, fumbling in the dark, but before I could turn it on, I saw it. A shadow. The moonlight filtering through the trees cast the figure in faint relief against the thin fabric of my tent. It was tall, lanky, the outline of a person unmistakable. They weren't moving anymore, just standing there, motionless, watching. The silence felt deafening. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. A drumbeat in my ears. I wanted to scream, to do anything to break the tension, but my throat was dry, my body frozen. And then they moved. The shadow crouched low, their head tilting, as if trying to listen for something inside the tent. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves under their weight, the subtle rasp of their breath. My mind raced through every possibility. A lost hiker, maybe. A hunter. But why wouldn't they say something? Why weren't they using a flashlight? I don't know how long they stayed there, crouched just inches from where I lay paralysed with fear. It could have been minutes, maybe an hour. At one point I thought I saw the shadow reach out, their hand pressing against the fabric of the tent. The material barely gave, but the pressure was enough to make my stomach churn. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind screamed at me to do something. Yell, grab the knife in my pack, anything. But my body refused to cooperate. Eventually the shadow straightened and walked away, their steps slow and deliberate, the way they had come. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the tent, too terrified to close my eyes, too scared to unzip the door and check if they were really gone. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I'd convinced myself it was just a bad dream. That was until I stepped outside. The ground around my tent was littered with footprints, large, deliberate ones, circling the tent again and again. My stomach churned as I noticed a stack of rocks piled neatly in the centre of the clearing, where there had been nothing the night before. It wasn't wildlife, it wasn't an accident. Someone had been there, watching me, listening. I didn't pack my gear. I threw it into my backpack haphazardly, barely stopping to zip it shut before heading back to my car. With every step I took, I felt the weight of the woods pressing in on me, the silence louder than it had been the night before. I never looked back. I didn't want to see if someone was watching me leave. To this day, I can't bring myself to camp alone again. Out there, surrounded by the vast nothingness of the wilderness, you realise how vulnerable you really are. All it takes is one shadow to remind you that sometimes the scariest monsters are just people. Camping was supposed to be an adventure, a bonding experience for me and my younger brother Jake. He had just turned 18 and begged me to take him on a real trip, away from the city and our overbearing parents. We settled on a remote state park in Montana, known for its expansive trails and pristine lakes. The idea of spending 3 nights out there, far from anyone, felt thrilling, and maybe a little bit reckless. We arrived late in the afternoon and hiked about 6 miles before setting up camp near a ridge overlooking a valley. The view was breathtaking. Miles of untouched wilderness stretched out beneath us, the kind of place that made you feel both awed and insignificant. That first night was peaceful. We shared stories, roasted marshmallows, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. Jake had gone down to the stream to fetch water while I stayed behind, tidying up our campsite. I was focused on arranging some firewood when I noticed something odd, a faint column of smoke rising through the trees, just beyond the ridge. "Jake!" I called out when he returned. "Did you see someone out there?" He shook his head, his brow furrowed. "I didn't see anyone. Why?" I pointed toward the smoke. "Looks like someone's camping nearby." Jake shrugged. "Probably a hiker. Let's check it out tomorrow." But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. There weren't many people who ventured this deep into the park, especially not this late in the season. The thought of someone else out here, someone we hadn't seen or heard, felt strange. That night, as we sat around our campfire, the smoke was still visible, curling lazily into the night sky. Jake joked about going over to say hi, but something about the silence around us made my skin crawl. Whoever they were, they hadn't lit a fire to cook or warm themselves. They were just sitting in the dark. We went to bed early, the unease gnawing at me, but sleep didn't come easily. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of twigs snapping. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard something unmistakable, the low murmur of voices. I nudged Jake awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He sat up, groggy, but when the voices carried again, his eyes went wide. "Who's out there?" he whispered back. The fire from the other camp was still faintly visible, but now it seemed closer. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the cadence of their conversation was strange, almost too calm, like they were trying not to be overheard. "Stay here," I told Jake, grabbing my flashlight. "Are you crazy? You're not going out there," he hissed, gripping my arm. But I needed to know. I had to see who they were. I stepped out of the tent and crept toward the ridge, my flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the occasional crunch of my boots on the dirt. The closer I got to the other campfire, the colder the air seemed to feel. When I finally reached the edge of the clearing, my stomach dropped. The fire was there, crackling softly, but the campsite was empty. There were no tents, no gear, just the fire and a half-burnt log resting on the ground. My pulse quickened. I turned to head back when I heard it again, the voices. But they weren't behind me. They were coming from the direction of our camp. I ran, tripping over roots and branches in my haste. My flashlight jostled in my hand as I broke through the trees and reached our campsite, where I found Jake standing in front of the fire, his face pale. "Someone was here," he said, his voice shaking. "What? What did you see?" He pointed to the ground near the fire pit. There were fresh boot prints, too large to be mine or Jake's, leading right up to our tent. We didn't sleep that night. We sat back to back, knives in hand, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. By morning, the other campfire was gone. No smoke, no sign it had ever been there. We packed up and hiked out, neither of us speaking much. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was just a coincidence, another hiker who meant no harm. But the way those voices sounded, the deliberate way those boot prints circled our fire, it felt like something worse, something intentional. And when I think back to that night, I can't help but wonder, if I'd stayed at their fire a little longer, would they have come back for me? I'd always loved camping. As a single mom, it was my way of showing my daughter, Lily, that adventure didn't have to mean luxury resorts or expensive trips. It was just the two of us, a tent, and the vast expanse of nature. That summer I picked a small, lesser-known campsite in upstate New York. The place was surrounded by thick woods and bordered a quiet lake, a perfect getaway for some mother-daughter bonding. We arrived late in the afternoon and Lily was buzzing with excitement. She was 10, with boundless energy and a fascination for anything outdoors. While I set up the tent, she darted off to explore the lake's edge, returning with a collection of smooth, flat stones for skipping across the water. By evening we were roasting hot dogs over the fire, laughing as Lily tried to toast marshmallows without setting them ablaze. The air smelled of smoke and pine, and the chirp of crickets filled the silence. It was perfect. Around 10 p.m, Lily yawned, her energy finally dwindling. I tucked her into her sleeping bag, promising her we'd go on a proper hike in the morning. I stayed up for a while, sipping tea and watching the embers of the fire glow faintly against the darkness. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, distant sound barely distinguishable from the rustle of leaves. But as I sat still, straining my ears, I realised it was something else. A voice. It sounded like a child crying. Every instinct in me screamed to check on Lily. I darted to the tent, unzipped it quietly, and peeked inside. She was sound asleep, her small face illuminated by the faint light of my lantern. Relieved, I stepped back out and listened again. The crying hadn't stopped. It was faint, but undeniably coming from deeper in the woods. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The crying continued, soft and distant, like it was drifting on the wind. It didn't sound panicked, just sad, mournful. My heart raced as I weighed my options. What if it was a lost child? What if someone was hurt and needed help? But something about the sound felt wrong. It was too steady, too rhythmic, like it wasn't coming from a real person but a recording on repeat. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my palms slick with sweat. I didn't want to leave Lily alone, but I couldn't ignore the sound. I stepped cautiously into the woods, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The crying grew louder as I moved farther from the campsite, but it never seemed to come closer. I called out again. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" No response. Just the steady, heart-wrenching sound of a child sobbing. After about 5 minutes of walking, I stopped. My flashlight illuminated a patch of ground where the leaves and twigs had been disturbed, as though someone had been sitting there. But there was no one. The crying abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I turned in a circle, my flashlight sweeping through the trees, half expecting to see someone lurking just beyond the beam. But there was nothing. No movement. No sound. A sudden sharp snap of a twig behind me made me spin around, knife raised. My flashlight caught the glint of something metallic on the ground. A small, rusted tin can lying next to a child's shoe, its laces frayed and muddy. My stomach churned. I backed away slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Finally, I forced myself to move. I turned and sprinted back toward the campsite, crashing through branches and underbrush, my flashlight bouncing wildly. When I reached the tent, Lily was still sleeping, undisturbed. I collapsed onto the ground, trembling, and kept watch until dawn, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. The next morning, I packed up as quickly as I could, telling Lily we'd go somewhere a little less buggy. She didn't question it, but I couldn't shake the unease. When we got home later that day, I called the local sheriff's office, explaining what I'd heard and seen. They said they'd send someone to check it out, though their tone made it clear they thought I was overreacting. Weeks later, the story broke on the news. 3 teenagers, all between the ages of 16 and 18, had been found murdered in the same forest where we camped. The details were horrifying. Investigators believed the teens had been lured deeper into the woods by the sound of a baby crying. Their bodies were discovered near a fire pit, the same area where I'd seen the disturbed ground and that rusted tin can. The sheriff's office released a warning to avoid the area, as whoever was responsible was still at large. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, how close I'd come to walking straight into whatever trap had been waiting in those woods. I still don't know if the crying was a recording or if someone had been hiding, using it to draw people in. But I know one thing for certain. If I hadn't turned back, Lily might have woken up to an empty tent and never seen me again. I haven't been camping since. Camping was never my thing. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I prefer a sturdy roof, working plumbing, and zero chances of being eaten by a bear. But my friends never let me hear the end of it. For years they hounded me, saying I was missing out on life, and this time I caved. Jake, the self-proclaimed adventurer of the group, convinced me it would be fun. We'll hike, tell ghost stories, drink by the fire. It's what memories are made of, he said. His enthusiasm was infectious, and soon our whole group was on board. Jake, his girlfriend Emily, her best friend Tasha, and reluctantly, me. We picked a remote campsite a couple of hours outside of town. Jake said it was prime real estate. Beautiful views, a lake nearby, and far enough from the main trail to guarantee privacy. We got there late in the afternoon, hauling our gear through a narrow dirt path before setting up camp near the tree line. The sun was setting by the time we finished, and honestly, it wasn't as bad as I'd feared. The lake shimmered in the distance, and the trees cast long, golden shadows over the ground. Even I had to admit it was kind of nice. By the time the fire was roaring, we were laughing and joking like kids again. Jake was telling some ridiculous story about his childhood when the sound of an engine broke through the quiet. I turned toward the trail. A battered old truck came into view, crawling toward us over the uneven dirt. The firelight caught on the rusted exterior, making it look almost skeletal. When the truck stopped, 4 men got out. They looked like they belonged to the truck. Dirty, rough around the edges, the kind of guys who always seem like they're looking for trouble. One of them was tall and broad-shouldered, with a greasy baseball cap pulled low over his face. Another had tattoos snaking up his arms, the ink disappearing under the sleeves of a tattered jacket. "Evening," the tall one said, his voice low and gruff. Jake, ever the friendly one, stood up and waved. "Hey there, just camping out for the night." The men exchanged looks, and something about the way they smiled set my teeth on edge. "Didn't think anyone would be out here," one of them said, his eyes scanning our campsite. "Y'all picked a good spot." But it wasn't just the tone of their voices or their ragged appearance that made me uneasy. It was the way their eyes lingered on Emily and Tasha, long, deliberate stares that made my skin crawl. One of them leaned against the truck, a smirk tugging at his lips as he muttered something under his breath. Whatever it was, it made the others chuckle. Emily shifted uncomfortably, folding her arms across her chest. Tasha edged closer to the fire, her eyes darting between the men and Jake, who was trying to steer the conversation back to neutral ground. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. Eventually the men climbed back into their truck and drove off, their laughter echoing through the trees long after they were gone. "That was weird," Jake said, shaking his head. "Weird? Are you kidding me?" I snapped. What were they even doing out here? They didn't have gear or anything, just a truck and bad intentions. "Relax, man," Jake said, rolling his eyes. "Not everyone's out to get us." But Emily cut him off. "No, he's right. Did you see the way they were looking at us? It was creepy." Tasha nodded, her face pale. "I don't like this. Can we move? Please?" Jake hesitated, but when both girls took my side, he finally relented. "Fine," he sighed. "Let's move. It's not like we've unpacked everything." We hiked about half a mile to a new spot, deeper into the woods but still within sight of the old campsite. Jake brought out his binoculars, laughing as he scanned the area. "See?" he said. "Nothing's happening. You're paranoid." But he handed me the binoculars anyway, and I kept watch, my stomach twisted in knots. Hours passed and the fire crackled as the others dozed off one by one. I stayed up, staring at the old campsite through the binoculars. That's when the trucks started arriving. The first one came just after midnight, followed by another, and then another. By the time the 5th truck pulled in, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the binoculars steady. "Jake," I whispered, nudging him awake. "What now?" he mumbled, sitting up. I handed him the binoculars without a word. He looked, his expression hardening as he adjusted the focus. 6 men got out of the trucks. They were wearing masks, some like ski masks, others more grotesque, like cheap Halloween masks. One of them carried a baseball bat, another a machete. They gathered around the fire pit we'd left behind, talking animatedly. I could see their gestures, the way they pointed toward the trees, like they were planning something. Jake handed the binoculars back to me, his face pale. "Wake everyone up," he said, his voice low and urgent. I didn't ask questions. Within minutes, we packed our gear, doused the fire, and started hiking back toward the trailhead as quietly as we could. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch, my ears straining for the sound of engines or footsteps behind us. We made it to the car just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Jake turned to me as we climbed in, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. "You were right," he said. "Something was off about those guys." We reported it to the police as soon as we got home. Months later, I got a call from a detective. He told me they were investigating an organised group of predators who targeted campers in remote areas. Their modus operandi was brutal. They'd kill the men, kidnap the women, and subject them to unspeakable horrors before killing them too. The detective said they'd had similar cases pop up every few years, but they'd never caught the group. The thought still haunts me. How close we came to becoming another statistic. I haven't been camping since. Some risks just aren't worth taking. It was supposed to be the camping trip of a lifetime. A group of 5 of us heading deep into the Rockies for a week of pure wilderness. It was me, my best friend Dylan, his girlfriend Rachel, my sister Mia, and her boyfriend Eric. The plan was to hike to a remote spot Dylan had read about online, far from any marked trails. No crowds, no noise, just us and nature. The first few days were incredible. The scenery was straight out of a postcard. Towering peaks, crystal clear lakes, and forests so dense they seemed untouched by time. We spent our days hiking, fishing, and laughing around the campfire. By the 3rd night, we were in the heart of nowhere. Our camp was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so tall they seemed to blot out the stars. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your fingers and toes, but makes the fire feel even cozier. We were sitting around the fire, joking and sharing stories, when Mia suddenly fell quiet. She was staring past the flames, her face pale. "What is it?" I asked, following her gaze. I thought I saw something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just an animal," Dylan said, brushing it off. "There's plenty of deer out here." Mia nodded but didn't look convinced. Eric pulled her closer, murmuring something to comfort her, and the rest of us went back to our conversation. But I couldn't shake the tension that had settled over the group. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up by the fire. I've always been a light sleeper, and the silence of the forest had me on edge. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. And then I felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I scanned the tree line, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. My pulse quickened, and I found myself gripping the flashlight tighter. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "You're imagining things." But as I turned to go back to the tent, I heard it. Branches snapping, slow and deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. No response. The sound stopped, but the forest seemed to hold its breath. I stood there for what felt like hours, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Eventually I crawled into my tent, every nerve on edge. The next morning, I told the group what I'd heard, but Dylan just laughed. "Man, you're letting this place get to you. It's probably a raccoon or something." Rachel, however, looked uneasy. "I don't know," she said. "I kept waking up last night. It felt like we weren't alone." We tried to brush it off and went about our day, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone seemed jumpy, constantly glancing over their shoulders. Even Dylan, the skeptic, looked uneasy when he thought no one was watching. That night the tension reached a breaking point. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of Eric whispering frantically outside the tent. I unzipped it to see him crouched by the dying fire, his face pale. "What's going on?" I asked. "Listen," he said, pointing toward the trees. At first I didn't hear anything, but then it came. Soft footsteps, moving around the camp. They weren't heavy, like an animal. They were human. "Who's there?" Eric called out, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. We stood there, staring into the darkness, but whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't answer. Slowly the rest of the group emerged from their tents, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on?" Dylan asked, his voice groggy. "Someone's out there," Eric said, gesturing toward the trees. Dylan grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the woods. The beam of light swept over the underbrush, illuminating nothing but tangled branches and shadows. And then, just as he was about to turn it off, the light caught something. Eyes. They were reflecting the beam, just beyond the tree line, unblinking and still. "Oh, hell no," Rachel whispered, clutching Dylan's arm. "Stay here," Dylan said, taking a step toward the trees. "Are you insane?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "We don't know who that is." Dylan hesitated, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly, they disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. We didn't sleep that night. By dawn, we decided to cut the trip short. As we packed up, Mia gasped and pointed at something near the edge of the clearing. There, carved into the bark of a tree, was a single word: watching. We left as fast as we could, our laughter and excitement replaced by silence and unease. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but sometimes late at night I think about those eyes in the dark, and I wonder if they ever stopped watching. When I was 19, I worked a summer job as a trail maintenance worker in the Pacific Northwest. It was mostly solo work, clearing brush, repairing signs and marking trails. The pay was decent, and I enjoyed the solitude. I thought nothing could shake me. That summer though, something happened that still haunts me. My supervisor had asked me to check an old cabin deep in the forest. It wasn't on the official map. It was used decades ago as a ranger's outpost, but now it was abandoned. Vandals had reportedly broken in, and my job was to assess the damage. The hike to the cabin was grueling. The trail, barely visible in some spots, snaked through dense woods that blocked out most of the sunlight. By the time I reached the clearing, the cabin stood there like a ghost. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, and windows clouded with grime. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. The cabin door was locked with a rusted padlock, which struck me as odd. I'd expected it to be wide open if vandals had been there. Still, I walked the perimeter, my boots crunching on dead leaves. As I rounded the back, I froze. A faint noise came from inside the cabin, soft and muffled, like someone moving. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone in there?" No answer. I hesitated, my hand resting on the hilt of the knife I always carried. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe whoever was inside didn't want to be found. I knocked on the door, harder this time. "If someone's in there, you need to leave. This is government property." Silence. Then a loud thump. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The sound had been deliberate, like someone slamming their fist against the wall. I was suddenly aware of how isolated I was. Taking a deep breath, I peered through one of the filthy windows. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but when they did, I wished I hadn't looked. The cabin was empty, except for a single chair in the centre of the room. Sitting on the chair was a pile of clothes, dirty, tattered, and stained with something dark. And then in the corner of the room I noticed something else. Scratches on the wall, deep and jagged, forming words. "Help me." My breath hitched. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I didn't know what to do. The logical part of my brain screamed to leave, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, held me there. I circled the cabin again, looking for any sign of who or what was inside. The padlock was still secure, the windows unbroken. That's when I saw it. Footprints, leading away from the cabin into the woods. They were fresh, the impressions sharp in the soft earth. But something about them was wrong. They didn't look like boots or sneakers, more like bare feet, with long, uneven toes. I didn't wait to find out more. I grabbed my pack and bolted, crashing through the underbrush until I hit the main trail. When I got back to the ranger station, I reported everything to my supervisor. He listened quietly, his face unreadable. When I finished, he sighed. "We've had incidents out there before," he said. "But there's no cabin on the official roster. Are you sure about what you saw?" His question made my blood run cold. I'd just been there, seen it with my own eyes. How could he not know about it? I never went back to that part of the forest. A few years later, I read about a missing person case in the same area. A hiker had vanished without a trace, their last known location just a few miles from where I'd found the cabin. Sometimes I wonder if I'd been seconds away from joining them. It was the summer before college, and my friends and I wanted one last adventure before life took us in different directions. We decided on a remote lake deep in the Appalachians. No cell service, no crowds, just us and the wilderness. The drive was long, and the hike to the lake was even longer. By the time we arrived, the sun was already low in the sky. The lake was stunning though, a perfect mirror reflecting the dense forest around it. The water was still, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional splash of fish. We set up camp on the shoreline, laughing and joking as we pitched our tents and gathered firewood. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Kyle, his girlfriend Jess, and her younger brother Ben. That night we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about everything from old high school memories to our fears about the future. The stars above were brighter than I'd ever seen, and for a while, everything felt perfect. Then we heard it. It started as a faint sound, barely audible over the crackling fire. A high-pitched wail, like the wind whistling through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, a long, drawn-out scream that echoed across the lake. "What the hell was that?" Ben asked, his face pale in the firelight. Kyle shrugged, trying to act nonchalant. "Probably an animal. Foxes can sound pretty freaky." But I could see the tension in his shoulders. He didn't believe what he was saying, and neither did I. The scream didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. We tried to brush it off, but the mood had shifted. The conversation died, and one by one we retreated to our tents. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scream again, playing on a loop in my head. Around 2 a.m, I heard the sound of the zipper on Kyle and Jess's tent. I poked my head out of mine and saw Kyle standing by the edge of the lake, staring across the water. "What are you doing?" I whispered, crawling out to join him. He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the opposite shore. "There's a light over there," he said, pointing. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Across the lake, through the trees, I could see a faint, flickering light. It looked like a fire, but it was too far to tell for sure. "Maybe it's other campers," I said, though I didn't believe it. We hadn't seen a single person on the trail, and this lake wasn't on any official maps. Kyle nodded, but his jaw was clenched. "Yeah, maybe." We stood there for a while, watching the light flicker. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it went out. The scream came again. This time it was so loud and close that I stumbled back, nearly falling into the water. Kyle grabbed my arm, and we bolted back to the tents, waking Jess and Ben. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's not right." Jess looked terrified, but Ben shook his head. "Leave? It's the middle of the night. What if we get lost?" Kyle hesitated, torn between staying and running, but then we heard something that made the decision for us. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the tree line behind us. None of us moved. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see each other's faces. "Hello?" Kyle called out, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from across the lake, the scream came again, louder than ever, as if whoever was making it was right behind us. We grabbed our gear and ran. The hike back to the car was a blur. Every shadow felt like it was watching us, every sound like it was following us. By the time we reached the parking lot, the sun was starting to rise. painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. We didn't stop until we were miles away, pulling over at a gas station to catch our breath. "Do you think it was just another group messing with us?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. None of us answered. A week later, I couldn't stop myself from looking up the area online. What I found chilled me to the bone. The lake had a dark history. Decades ago, a family camping there had vanished without a trace. The only clue was a neighbour's report of hearing screams late at night, echoing across the water. I still don't know what we heard or saw that night. And honestly, I don't want to know. I wasn't supposed to be camping that weekend. My friend Alex had begged me to join him and his girlfriend Mia on a quick overnight trip to a national forest a few hours away. I'd initially declined. Camping wasn't really my thing, but after a long week at work, the idea of disconnecting for a night started to sound appealing. The campsite Alex picked was about 4 miles off the main trail, isolated and quiet. By the time we arrived, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. We set up our tents near a small clearing and got a fire going. Everything was fine at first. We laughed, roasted marshmallows, and even shared a few ghost stories. The air was cool, the fire crackling, and for the first time in a while, I felt relaxed. Then as the fire burned low, Mia froze mid-sentence, her eyes locked on the tree line. "What's wrong?" Alex asked. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "See what?" I asked, glancing toward the trees. "There was someone standing there," she said, her face pale. Alex laughed nervously. "Come on, Mia, it's probably just the shadows playing tricks on you." But I could see the fear in her eyes, and it made my stomach twist. We decided to call it a night, though Mia was clearly still shaken. I offered to keep watch for a while, trying to make her feel better. Alex shrugged it off and went to bed, leaving me alone by the fire. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the flickering flames, but the quiet was unsettling. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, made my nerves jangle. And then I heard it, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the underbrush. "Hello?" I called out, standing up and shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and bushes. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flash of movement, but it was gone before I could be sure. I told myself it was nothing, a raccoon maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, as we were packing up, Alex noticed something odd. "Hey," he said, pointing to the edge of the clearing. "Isn't that your backpack?" I turned and my heart dropped. My backpack was lying at the base of a tree, about 20 feet from where I'd left it. "I didn't put it there," I said, my voice trembling. Mia frowned. "Maybe it fell when you were moving stuff." But I hadn't moved it. I was sure of that. As I walked over to retrieve it, I noticed something even more unsettling. The zipper was undone and the contents had been emptied out. My water bottle, snacks, flashlight, all of it was scattered on the ground. But it wasn't just tossed around. It was arranged. The items were lined up in a straight row, each one perfectly spaced apart. "What the hell?" Alex muttered, stepping closer. "I didn't do this," I said, my voice shaking. Mia grabbed Alex's arm, her face pale. "Let's just go," she said. We packed up as quickly as we could and started the hike back to the car. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone lurking in the trees. When we finally reached the parking lot, there was only one other car there, a beat-up old sedan with its windows rolled down. It hadn't been there when we'd arrived. As we loaded our gear into the trunk, a man emerged from the woods, his clothes dirty and his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't say a word, just stood there staring at us. Alex nodded at him, trying to act casual, but the man didn't respond. He just watched as we climbed into the car and drove away. A few days later, I couldn't stop thinking about the incident. I went online to look up the area and found a news article that made my blood run cold. A hiker had gone missing near that same trailhead a year earlier. According to the report, his friends said he'd wandered off during the night, leaving his backpack behind. Search teams had found the bag, but not him. The eerie part? His belongings had been arranged in the exact same way as mine, lined up in a perfect row. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but whoever they were, they wanted us to know we weren't alone. And with that, dear wanderers, our collection of chilling tales from the campfire draws to a close. Thank you for joining me in this shadowed corner of the Midnight Apothecary, where every story is a tincture brewed to stir your deepest fears. Before you go, I invite you to become a part of our dark apothecary. Do you have a story of your own? One that sends shivers down your spine and whispers in the night? Send it to the email in the description below, and it might just find its way into our next batch of horrors. Until next time, may the darkness never find you unprepared. Stay safe, and remember, not all stories end when the fire dies out. Sweet nightmares, my friends. And with that, dear wanderers, our collection of chilling tales from the campfire draws to a close. Thank you for joining me in this shadowed corner of the Midnight Apothecary, where every story is a tincture brewed to stir your deepest fears. Before you go, I invite you to become a part of our apothecary. Do you have a story of your own? One that sends shivers down your spine and whispers in the night? Send it to the email in the description below, and it might just find its way into our next batch of horrors. Until next time, may the darkness never find you unprepared. Stay safe, and remember, not all stories end when the fire dies out. Sweet nightmares, my friends.